Thank you, and welcome to the Child Welfare Information Technology Systems Managers and Staff webinar series brought to you on behalf of the Health and Human Services Administration for Children and Families, Children's Bureau. Today's roundtable features a distinguished panel from 3 states who will discuss their experiences and challenges relating to cloud computing. I am Joyce Rose, your host and facilitator for today's discussion. Next slide, please. I want to thank our panelists for their time and effort in preparing for this roundtable, and I would like to ask them to introduce themselves. Linda?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Linda Jewell. I'm the Assistant Director, Chief Information Officer for the Arizona Department of Child Safety.
Jay?
Hi, my name is Jay Cline. I'm the Infrastructure Architect at the Arizona Department of Child Safety.
Valli?
Hello, everyone. My name is Vallimanalan Thirugnanam, go shortly by Valli. I'm the Director of Applications, Maryland Department of Human Services.
And last but not least, Joe.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joe Vastola. I'm the Chief Information Officer at the Florida Department of Children and Families.
Thank you. A very distinguished panel. So next slide, please. Attendees are encouraged to participate in the roundtable with discussion, questions, or comments. All of the participant lines are muted now, but we will open them for the Q&A session at the end of the panel discussion. Please be aware that you can submit questions at any time using the GoToWebinar chat feature, and those will be queued up and addressed during the Q&A session. Once today's roundtable has ended, you may submit additional questions to the email address listed or to your federal analyst. Next slide, please. So what is our format for today's roundtable? I will pose a series of questions to prompt our state panelists in a discussion focusing on these topics, which I trust will give rise to an informational as well as lively discussion. We're going to set some context. In other words, we're going to take a look at each state's cloud infrastructure schematic. We are going to discuss and understand the cost of cloud computing, some governance structure, contract and payment structures, staffing issues and managing vendor changes and upgrades, understanding the build and release cycles and other complexities of cloud computing, and then, of course, the time-honored lessons learned. Next slide, please. So to establish some context, our state panelists will explain their programmatic and technical cloud computing environments, starting with Linda and Jay from Arizona.
Hi, this is Jay. Basically what we're looking at here is the main components that we use of a cloud-oriented nature. As a department and an agency, we were pretty in a good spot, actually, when we started setting this up, as we were separating from another state agency at the time. So we got a very unique ability to set up these services basically from the ground up. We didn't have to do a lot of transferring from an on-prem style infrastructure to cloud style. We actually got to set up almost everything ground up brand new. Most of our current resources sit in the Azure government tenant, so a lot of VMs, platform services, software system services. Most of those things sit up there. We heavily utilize currently Office 365, obviously, for things like email, internal communications on Skype. We're currently utilizing OneDrive for lots of home directory information. We're leveraging VMware's Horizon Air infrastructure for a virtual desktop infrastructure. This allows non-DCS entities to connect to a DCS environment, but we don't have to worry about them connecting through a dedicated VPN on their equipment. It allows them to connect through our equipment, but from a hosted infrastructure side. We have another vendor that actually hosts one of our core business applications. They are also hosted in the Azure government tenant, as well as setting up OnBase for enterprise content management system, also in a Highland hosted enterprise environment. For everything that we sit on-prem currently, the only aspects we have are our core network infrastructure, so some Cisco devices and roughly about 4 physical servers. So we're currently sitting at about 2 racks of equipment inside a hosted data center here in Arizona. Everything else that we have of roughly the 90-plus servers is all in a virtual hosted cloud-style environment. Next slide, please. So this kind of outlays 2 of our main business applications that we're using. So this actually outlays a little bit of side-by-side environments as well. You can see there's 2 groups of people currently listed in red that list DCS providers and DCS mobile application users. And this is what I'm going to reference mainly as our current environment versus the one that we're in the process of building and transitioning to. So DCS providers are entities and agencies that work with DCS on some of our information, such as foster care providers and licensing agencies, and they connect into our environment to connect to our core business application, which is currently running in another state agency that we connect to that we're in the process of migrating off. They connect through those VDI, those hosted desktop infrastructure that's sitting inside VMware. That VDI infrastructure then talks to the identity management and all of our infrastructure services sitting inside the Azure Government Cloud, which has an express route link, so a dedicated connection back to our physical infrastructure where actually the mainframe environment and all of the back-end data actually lives. The more current information we have for our actual users is we released a mobile application, something that our field workers can use for tablet-oriented information, but allows them to link into a mainframe backend. So it provides a much easier use of their information and access of their information while they're out in the field without using either heavier laptops or, heaven forbid, paper and pencil. So they actually access that mobile application through another hosted instance that was that previous Azure Government instance that a vendor provides. That Azure Government instance then has an express route back to our physical center, which then talks to our identity management and our Azure Government Cloud, which then talks back to our physical mainframe. Now, both of these systems, they work. The problem with it is at this point, and what we're trying to transition off, obviously, is a physical mainframe environment. So we're currently looking at transitioning to the second side, basically the right side of this slide, where all providers, all DCS employees, and even Arizona citizens can access all the data from our core business application through a common front end. And so we're going to be going more to a hosted CRM. We're actually planning on using Dynamics in O365 to provide these portals and access, which will link very similarly as the previous ones, but provide, like I said, a very common infrastructure to get this done and allow us to store all the information necessary for this in Dynamics itself and our Azure Government environment, which will hopefully, at some point in time in the near future, remove our necessity of hosting that mainframe and that physical infrastructure in the on-prem data center that we currently have now. Linda, do you want to add anything?
No, so that was a lot of information for everybody to consume, but you can see we are 100% cloud except for our core networks and some of our legacy systems. That wasn't this is a 3-year strategy in the making, and Jay made it sound very, very easy, but there were some things that we definitely had to put in place. Some good contracting to put in place, some good SLAs and vendor management, understanding all of those dependencies, especially when to run the network connections, the dedicated connections. Our state really wasn't set up for us to be able to leverage any kind of express route or any kind of technology to cloud environments, dedicated connections. And we really had to kind of forge that path ourselves and come up with some things. So anybody looking at really building cloud utilization, do not underestimate some of the work that's required in the vendor management and contract management in order to make that happen. Your state might not be set up to have all of those agreements in place, especially on the network side.
Fantastic. And Linda, thank you very much. And we're going to explore some of those concepts that you just talked about later on in our entire panel discussion. So let's move to the Florida cloud schematic, and Joe Vastola, please.
Thanks, Joyce. This is Joe. So Florida, similar but different to what we just heard. Back in December of 2017, we completed the transition of our child welfare system off of the mainframe platform and then transitioned the production, test, development, and training environments, basically lock, stock, and barrel of our child welfare system into the Amazon public cloud. And so today we're running for all infrastructure as a service components for our child welfare system in the cloud. And included with this transition, probably like most states who receive services from a state data center, our state data center here in Florida doesn't just provide us with infrastructure as a service. They're also our managed service provider. So they're the folks who are responding to issues, hardware and network, et cetera, keeping things patched. And so part of this transition took us out of that service subset. And so included with the move of the system to the cloud, we also had to create a structure and a set of contracts for overall managed services of the system. So today we're sitting with our child welfare system running completely in the Amazon cloud, and we've been able to leverage the cloud environment for a couple things. One was extension of our analytics environment. So included with our state child welfare system is a data warehouse that we've used over time for all of the reporting, both ad hoc and operational, and any analytics that we've done. And so there's been a goal here at the department in Florida to integrate our client data, all services across all our systems. And so one of the ways we've been able to leverage the cloud is by creating a environment for big data. And so we've got a big data virtual environment now that links all of our child welfare clients to all of the client data that's contained in our other key legacy systems, including public assistance and our substance abuse and mental health systems, which still reside in our state data center. And so all of that data is hosted in a virtual environment now that we've got in the cloud, and we use it for integration, analytics. We're starting to build a data science environment, set of tools so that we can begin leveraging some of the capabilities of predictive analytics and machine learning above that, and then to extend our master client index, which is integrating and matching clients across all these systems into a master data management environment. So we've got a master data management tool that we've installed and hosted and have linked to all this data. We're in the process of establishing governance and the necessary controls and processes that we need to properly support that. And then in addition to that, we've also in the cloud established an environment for security incident and event management. So we've got a SIM tool that we're running in the Amazon public cloud that's hooked right now to our public assistance environment. We'll be extending that over time. But it's basically monitoring all logs across the basically the 1,000 servers that make up that system and the mainframe which it runs on. And we've got a set of contracted resources that manage and monitor that and then report back into my security team here at the department. And so our goal is really to work towards extending this to pull all of our legacy data, all of our clients, get them all matched and hosted, available for analytics and integration in our big data environment, and really to continue supporting the system for child welfare out of the cloud.
Thank you, Joe. The whole notion of programmatic big data, I think, is a fascinating topic, and we may want to add that to a list for a future webinar. Before we move on to Marilyn, I have a question. Joe, you mentioned that you're using the Amazon public cloud. Arizona, Linda J., is Azure a private cloud or a public cloud?
So Azure is a public cloud, but Azure has two main identities around to it. They have the commercial side for your standard businesses, and then they have the government side, which is reserved specifically for state and federal entities. The difference between those two is a lot of times on the capabilities, but also on the certifications that they provide in terms of the things like level of FedRAMP certification, the type of data that you can host in there out of the box without having to input some third-party options. The commercial side is very, very close in terms of certifications to the government side, but for those agencies that need to store much more sensitive data, be it CGIS type data or HIPAA type data, the government side tends to be a little bit better in terms of making sure those certifications exist and are approvable when you have an audit. The only problem that I will say with the government side is that it does lag by about 6 months in terms of the features that are available on commercial side. It's a double-edged sword on that one, though, because you may lag 6 months behind, but by the time it gets to you, it's very well proven and very unlikely to cause any issues when you decide to use that feature.
Great. Thank you, Jay. All right, Valli, how about Maryland's cloud architecture, please? Next slide, Irene.
Sure, yeah. Hi, this is Valli Thirugnanam. So I just heard both Arizona and Florida. I think we kind of have a similar type of setup here, but we are a little bit different in terms of what we are hosting here. So obviously we are using Amazon public cloud. I heard Arizona's team talking about HIPAA and using their government cloud. So we are not using government cloud. So we're using public cloud, and we are working on getting the necessary certifications to store HIPAA data as well. So let me start kind of giving you a quick overview about the program that we are currently engaged in the state of Maryland. This is called MD-Think. You'll see the slide on the top right-hand side. It's a Maryland Total Human Services Integrated Network. It's an ambitious project. The governor's office started last year. The idea here is to bring all the agencies within the state of Maryland to use a shared infrastructure as well as a platform as a service. So we chose to go with AWS, commercial public cloud. So what we have done since the initialization of this program since last year, we built the platform architecture, including the infrastructure, and there are a lot of platform services that we have built. The idea here is to bring the various agency applications, kind of plug them in the platform itself. It's a dedicated platform we built for the state of Maryland. In terms of how we have architected the solution, we actually kept it very simple. Obviously, we have all the layers to address security, data protection, access rights, and everything is managed within Amazon itself, and we're using various products. If you start from the left-hand side, we have the State Security Administration staff. They actually manage all the user accounts. We are also creating the consumer portal as well as worker portal. Both will be managed by this team. Then we have the customer portal, which will be used by the clients. So we are talking about multiple agencies. Child welfare is one of the applications. We are also bringing the eligibility, like federal SNAP, cash type of programs as well as Medicaid. That will also come into this platform. And we're also bringing the child support application as well as on this platform. So 3 major applications are being built simultaneously. So the architecture-wise, we do have a mobile application support. In the MD-Think platform level, that sits on top of the cloud infrastructure hosted by AWS. All the service calls are managed by our API gateway, so we focus heavily on microservice architecture. We do have a typical web application and database layer, the multi-tier application. Each of the agency applications are built with the same architecture, using the MVC pattern for that. On the core platform services side, we have listed almost all of the key ones here. The Enterprise Service Hub. This helps to manage real-time data exchanges. We do have exchanges with Federal Data Hub, and there are other federal systems to support our child support program. So we do have all those real-time data exchanges managed by Enterprise Service Hub. Then we have Rules Engine, which is managed by our Corticon product. DevOps, I'll probably touch base more on the DevOps during our Q&A session, but we do have an extensive set of platform-specific tools that we have put together for DevOps support. API management, we have WSO2. This is the product that we have used for securing all our APIs. Identity management, of course, that's one of the key things that we use out of box from 2 vendors. I don't want to actually talk about the names of those product vendors, but they are available in AWS public cloud. One of the things I believe Joe I think Arizona talked about was log management, security, monitoring. We have a Splunk as our product to do that. BI, reporting, analytics, we have various products that are available in our platform as well. The bottom 4 platform services, master data management, enterprise content management, enterprise search, and data lake. We completed building all of this within the last, I would say 18 months. What we have done here is to create this platform as a service model, which allows any application can interact directly with the 4 data-related platform service, and it will be like more used as a plug-and-play type of design. And one of the key things I want to highlight here is the change data capture we call CDC. This is the methodology we are using to keep the data lake up to date. So from various application databases, we are capturing the data and pushing them to data lake. So the data lake will be consumed by our data scientists, analysts, and as needed, we may open up that for public consumption after we de-identify any of the sensitive information. On the right-hand side, I highlighted the data exchanges, the different system interfaces we have. So overall, this cloud infrastructure and the MDThink platform currently is in production. We have 2 pilot applications that we have put into production already. As of last month, we released about 250 user type of application for one of the family investment agency. So that is going very well at this point. So some of the key points I think I heard from Arizona as well as from Florida are managing the vendors and keeping the infrastructure in place. It's not just keeping the cloud vendor in place, right? It's more about making sure the workers and even the clients, the consumers, they are able to access the application as and when they need without any delay. So the infrastructure outside of the cloud is very, very important, and that is one of the key aspect that the state of Maryland, governor's office, focused, and we're building and extending bandwidth for a lot of our agency offices. So that's one of the key things. So we'll talk more about some of the highlights on how we managed the governance, the vendors, and what are the various things that we learned so far, in the Q&A session.
Okay, thank you, Valli. I think we can all agree that this takes a significant amount of planning, and there's a heck of a lot of detail, and designing and implementing a cloud architecture is certainly not for the faint of heart. So let's actually begin our panel discussion. Next slide, please. And I'm going to plant the seeds here and get our panelists in a discussion. So we're going to start with Jewell Vastola from Florida. I'm going to ask, please, which governance model has Florida employed when in the cloud?
Hey, Joyce, it's Joe. I think there's a couple areas of governance that we've had to address. Since our whole system is there, quite frankly, all of the processes associated with change management, approval, all of the governance, the application governance management processes have had to be modified. Mostly that's because we're dealing with dollars a little differently. So on our state data center, we had a state budget that basically was capped. It was appropriated budget defined by the legislature, and we really didn't have control of the changes or up and down changes or the costs associated with some of the various projects and enhancements that we would make. That all changes with the cloud. So now with the cloud, we're dealing with what I'll call real money, right, because it changes the minute you make a change. And so, first of all, our processes for overall management of the system from a financial perspective, financial governance had to change, and we had to establish a whole set of processes to be able to review, understand the costing of changes, estimate those costs both for cloud infrastructure, for managed services, for network capacity changes, for storage, basically to identify all of those costs and the impact that they would have immediately upon change, and establish a process for review, comparison of budget, and then approval. And so the management infrastructure for the cloud for us is probably governance-wise the key area that we've had to spend a lot of time and we've learned a lot about. That is extended also to, in some cases, the way we charge back our customers. So in our state data center, it was relatively easy for us to determine funding by customer, which we have to do, as everybody would know, to charge back the right state and federal programs, because our state agency, our state technology agency that was running the infrastructure, would determine those costs and give it to us separated by our primary application. So now we've got one system running in the cloud. We've got other multiple programs that feed and information to and from the cloud and that require those services. We've got mixed networking that traverses the path from the department to the cloud. And so we started to look at some of the challenges around how we make sure that the billing and the allocation of costs for resources that we put up into the cloud are accurate and properly reflected. In some cases, it's easy to track. Right, in the cloud, I know exactly what a server and storage and all of the elements that make up a particular environment cost. But I don't necessarily have that same breakdown for network costs and traffic that flow over our network to Amazon. So governance, from our perspective, was primarily around overall application and operational management. That certainly has also influenced the way we estimate and communicate with our state and federal partners. So all of that billing and all of the estimates that we need to properly create a cost-benefit analysis have to now take that into account. Or, as I said before, it was really handled by our state agency and the data center staff that were there.
Thank you, Joe. Linda, Jay, Valli, do you have any additional information regarding governance models that you have employed?
Hi, this is Linda from Arizona. I'll weigh in here. I look at, I don't really see our governance model really changed. I mean, we looked at the cloud as just another location that our applications were hosted, as well as some of our other infrastructure. Of course, Jay may disagree on that because it's a little bit more complex. But as far as, really understanding, like Joe said before, really understanding your change process, but the cost that's where you need to really understand and get into that. That's where we touch in a little bit on vendor management, which I think we'll cover in a little bit. But as far as the governance, I didn't really see anything changing, but understanding how the costs operate, understanding the throughput that you need in your network to maintain good connectivity to your cloud services, and understanding how to onboard constantly changing cloud services. So at least on the Azure side, there are new services being spun up that you can utilize in Azure environment a lot. So you need to know how to onboard and how to accept those changes in your environment.
And yes, we are going to get into a deeper discussion about payment structures and other costs. Valli, do you have comments regarding the Maryland governance model?
Yeah, I have a couple of comments. I think I agree with both Joe and Linda. We actually have most of the times getting in agreement with agencies on how the cost sharing is going to work. That's one of the key things. The good thing is most of the agency secretaries they're already onboarded, with the idea of sharing a platform. So they signed a MOU, memorandum of understanding from the beginning. So that helped us to just work out the details rather than trying to figure out how to get the agencies to come on board. In terms of, I think cost is one factor, but the governance of how the licensing of various, products that we are using or each agency might be using, the sharing of that was, one of the key things. And we always struggled working with product vendors, bringing their license into a cloud environment and have them share for the entire state was always a challenge. But we have a very good legal team that takes care of it, working closely with our procurement, and we were able to navigate through most of the challenges with the end user license agreements, the SLAs, with the product vendors. So that's one of the key challenges we faced, but we were able to overcome that. So that's the key point here is getting that early enough in the governance model helped us to resolve all those issues that we faced.
And that's a great segue into our next question, which I'm going to ask Linda and Jay to respond to first. And that question is, what are the changes needed in contract language or licensing or payment structures with cloud vendors?
Hi, this is Jay. So contract language is an interesting thing because that's something that obviously I don't think you're really going to change so much. Contract language is just difficult to deal with no matter what type of contract you're working on. But there are obviously certain key things you need to look at when dealing with a cloud vendor and make sure that your contract sort of outlines these things. And every vendor is going to be slightly different in terms of how they deal with these things. So depending on how you decide to use the service, everybody's going to be slightly different. But you have things like everybody's usually aware with SLA, service level agreements. So when there's an outage, how does this happen? How does the vendor deal with it? How do you deal with it? These need to be obviously clearly outlined. And the interesting thing about SLAs and these types of contracts is they might outline a very general SLA of, I'll just use a generic example of 99.9% uptime. But that 99.9% uptime usually has an asterisk next to it, stating to the fact of only certain types of services and how you configure them may be available for that level of uptime. So you really need to dig into the details about what you're looking at there. Plus, I've seen contracts before, and we've dealt with them specifically here at the state, where that SLA and that downtime only comes into effect when you've actually reported it to the vendor. So as a sake of argument, if a service goes down for the weekend and you don't report it to the vendor, that 48 hours of downtime technically doesn't count against their SLA. It only counts, let's say, on Monday morning when somebody complains the service is down and you actually start reporting it. So things like these in terms of how they deal and how they count with that SLA time makes big difference across those vendors. And with SLAs, you also want to have a good visibility into their service health. One sort of problem that a lot of cloud vendors have providing is a level of transparency to look at the actual base level of that service health and that services that you're running off of them. They'll have basic ones that say, yes, the core services are functioning or they're red, yellow, green, but figuring out exactly what's impacted based on those extremely high-level dashboards that they provide is not easy to do. So you have to get into a lot of vendor management even beyond this to start being able to interface with that vendor, figure out what is actually impacted, get those details, and move across from there. The other aspect, a lot of these things you have to deal with, obviously, is data. Data is a huge one when dealing with these contracts because it all comes down to what you're storing in the cloud. And obviously dealing with the government side of things, you're dealing with very sensitive data most of the time. From our aspect, we're dealing with a lot of PII, personal information data, HIPAA-style data, and even more so than that. And making sure that whatever vendor you're utilizing has the ability of meeting the criteria to host that data is one thing. But again, there's always an asterisk when it comes to these things, and that is specifically stating that they may be able to host that in a secure manner, but it may not be done out of the box. There may be extra configurations that you need to look at and you need to do to make sure that that data actually meets something like HIPAA compliance. I'll give a very basic example of Google. Google Drive is very easily available to make HIPAA compliant, but out of the box, if you put information inside Google Drive, it is not HIPAA compliant. They'll give you the steps to actually make it HIPAA compliant, but you need to go through an extra set of requirements to make that happen. So, and also when going back to data, it's about retention at that point. If you decide to leave a vendor, what happens to that data? Is it destroyed? Is it given back to you? Do you have verification that that data no longer lives inside that vendor's environment? A lot of these agencies, ours included, lives and breathes on the data that we have and that we're able to provide. So making sure that that data management is one of the key aspects of looking at this, from my personal opinion, is one of the highest on the list.
Thanks, Jay. This is Linda, and I just want to tag on a little bit to that too. So even that's within the cloud environment, but it's also really important to understand how you need to get data to the cloud environment. So we also looked at, and if you saw our beginning slide where we showed all of our different kinds of network connections that we had there, those were also considerations that we required to make our cloud healthy. Did we understand the throughput required? If we have 2,800 employees and close to 8,000 connecting vendors coming up through our cloud, do we have the right throughput? And getting those contracts and negotiations and even hardware in place to be able to handle those dedicated network connections.
Joe or Valli?
Yeah, this is Joe. Just to add to that, and again, setting the context here, our picture is one of running our child welfare system up there. So we've had a number of interesting contract dynamics that we've had to deal with. First of all, chances are when you're going to the cloud, I can't speak for Microsoft, but you're going to be buying cloud services from a reseller. You're not going to be buying directly from Amazon. They don't sell directly. I think Google also uses resellers. I think Microsoft, you can buy it either way. But so when you're looking at SLAs, it's good to see what the cloud providers' SLAs are, but the real ones that you're going to live and die by are the ones that you get from your managed service provider. There's interesting and new elements that go into contracts when you're setting up these environments, and some of it relates to the model that you're going to plan to put in place. And by that, as example, and specifically, I mean things like are you and your staff in your organization going to be responsible for changing and modifying the environment, increasing the resources, adding resources to it? Are you going to push that to your managed service provider? You got to decide those things because you'll have to contractually deal with responsibilities for things like the keys to the account, who makes those changes, and how the penalties relate to those kinds of elements. And I think then, just as an additional consideration, there's also a decision you have to make around who owns the security of your cloud environment. So that's one thing we worked really hard to understand and make sure that we had locked up appropriately like we should. But coming out of our state data center, the state data center owned the security of that environment. Just by getting a cloud provider and a managed service provider, a reseller, it doesn't necessarily set up the responsibilities for who needs to secure that environment. And so there's additional services that you consider if you're going to have the managed service provider have SLAs or penalties around security. And those are the kind of things that we found to be different in terms of contracting, just the fact that there were elements, even though we had SLAs with our state data center that we didn't have to deal with, that had to be put into contracts as we went through this process.
Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, that's
Valli?
Yeah, this is Valli. Yeah, that's a great point, Joe. We actually, thought about the same way, and we obviously have to use a reseller. One thing that we did a little bit differently is obviously we wanted to go with a reseller who has some reputation and also should be able to take care of issues if something goes wrong. So we took some time to narrow down to a set of managed service providers who can be a reseller, and obviously our SLA, our penalty clause, and all those things. It took obviously months for us to work it out with them, but it was one of the key consideration. I mean, I'm talking about for any state going to go with a cloud provider. They have to think about all these aspects what Joe was talking about, because those are the key areas. The states typically have control when they have their own data center, but you probably are giving the control away when you are going to cloud. But there are several other mechanisms we have in place. For example, Joe, you talked about managing the keys. So we took control of that, and obviously from the state government side, we have a security team that manages that part. Similarly, onboarding the agencies, onboarding users, we actually have control of all of that. So that kind of, takes the risk away from the vendor perspective, but we still own and control all those access, who gets access, and we also have the ability to monitor what's getting out of the cloud as well.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting, and I'm sure our attendees, their ears are maybe burning right now. Before we leave discussion about costs and payment structures, I'm going to ask a question about egress costs, and understanding that uploading data to the internet, which goes out of the local network, is the definition of egress. What should states be aware of regarding those costs? Valli, would you like to start us off, please?
Yeah, that's one of the, this is Valli. This is one of the key considerations. I mean, we just started this entire program about, I would say, a little over a year ago. We had some estimation, initially working at, the current usage from the various agency applications, and then expecting either a similar or more than the usage of what was, being trending. The good news is, based on what we have observed, we were able to control, the cost on, the egress. But we can only control to certain extent, because, every agency has the right to get the data out of the platform for their own use. So we are still trying to figure out a method, on how to actually keep this in an optimized way. I mean, we are still figuring it out, but one of the areas that we may probably find out maybe a couple of years from now, once we have identified trending, we should be able to put some control around this and find a way to offload some of the data. We talked about like using the snowball option, and we still have some of the data centers in the state where we could offload some of the data without using the network bandwidth. So that's something that we are still considering, and that is one of the other aspects when we negotiated with the reseller how we are going to actually bulk download data without impacting our cost. So that's one of the key things that we considered as well.
Okay. Linda, Jay, Joe, comments?
Hi, this is Jay. Well, egress costs are an interesting thing because a lot of times, depending on the actual cloud vendor that you're dealing with, egress costs may be more or less. So I'll use, obviously, state of Arizona as an example, but for a couple things, you can look at egress cost, obviously, from the state data center to the cloud, but you also have to look at egress costs, obviously, from the cloud to either external agencies back to your state data center, people that are consuming that data out of that cloud environment. When you start shifting an infrastructure from an on-prem style environment to a cloud environment, one of the obvious things that changes is you usually have less compute infrastructure on-prem because you're shifting that to the cloud. But you have to bolster that usually with some network infrastructure on the back end, so you can actually support now all the connectivity required to support that egress traffic and that in and out data now of your physical clients that are sitting technically on-prem and your cloud-based resources. The other aspect you have is, for us, I'll use Azure as an example, egress costs out of Azure are actual costs you have to deal with on a monthly basis. But it depends on the type of traffic as to whether or not you're actually charged. So looking at the resources that you're dealing with and making sure that you're grouping proper resources together so you're not doing anything like splitting a resource that does a lot of data consumption, so part of it is on-prem and part of it is in the cloud, to try to reduce that amount of traffic that's going through and the obvious amount of cost. Going back to Azure as an example, though, they do allow certain types of egress traffic to be 100% free. They want you to use certain services, so they give this to you as a benefit, with that example mainly being backup and restore. I can back up all of my physical infrastructure on-prem to a storage infrastructure sitting inside Azure, and if one of those resources dies and I need to restore that from that backup, that egress traffic is 100% free. None of that is actually charged to me because they want me to consume that service. So it really depends on what you're actually using these things for.
Okay. Joe, Linda?
This is Joe. Just one additional point to add to all that good information. When you're considering some of your data movement costs, it's not just egress from the cloud to you. It may also be communication based on the structure of your cloud provider and the solution that you've got up there. And specifically what I mean by that is, for example, in Amazon, they have different availability zones, which are basically data centers throughout the country. And depending how you structure your application, you take advantage of those availability zones and you run instances of your application across them to get what is basically immediate or near immediate disaster recovery. And so in Amazon, when you're spanning availability zones, you're also paying for the network traffic that goes between them. So it's not only coming out from the cloud, depending on your cloud provider and the structure of your solution, you may also be paying for data that moves within the cloud and its structure.
Very interesting. Linda, do you have additional comments? Or?
No, I don't have anything to add on egress. I think everyone covered the topic quite well, actually.
Cool. Okay, let's move on to another topic, and that's personnel. And Valli, I'm going to ask you to start. What considerations should states give to the type and number of IT staff to support the cloud environment?
Sure, yeah, this is Valli. This is actually one of the interesting topics because this is something that I'm managing for state of Maryland. So obviously, when we take applications into cloud, we try to use as many as products as possible instead of doing any customization. What this means is we have to have specialized, resources with experience in dealing with the specific products. When we were dealing with probably mainframe days or client-server architecture days, we might be able to use resources who could actually, well-versed with the multiple products or technologies. But unfortunately, with the cloud computing, there are resources who are specialized in specific products, and that's the only thing they actually do, for various reasons. We want, the isolation in terms of, separation of duty, as well as we want to actually optimize the resources that are available to get things done efficiently and quickly. So this posed a lot of challenges for us when we try to find a way to get the resources, mostly on the vendor side as well as on the state side. So we had to find resources with specific skills, and there are a lot of areas where we need to have some overlap. So we have to kind of consider all those factors before we can get the resources with the specific skill set hired. One of the challenges we face, we currently still face, when we try to hire resources through our vendors, they also try to find these specialized skilled resources, and they actually, I would say 5 or 6 out of 10 times, they probably are, struggling to find the right resource for us. But we are taking our own time and doing some research in the market to find the right resources. Mostly we are using our IDIQ type of contracts. So we are not really using one vendor or specific vendor to do all our work related to infrastructure, platform building, or even application development. So we actually are kind of putting the structure in place in identifying the resources. And it is one of the challenges on the state side as well. With the cloud computing, a lot of folks who are familiar with mainframe or client-server architecture, they have to be retrained to learn about the new technology. So that is another area we are actually, continue to work on to, improve their skill set as well.
Linda, how did Arizona approach considerations regarding IT staff supporting your environment?
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, and we're a little bit different than what Maryland, I think, had to overcome. So as Jay had mentioned earlier, we were separating from another agency, so we literally built our IT group from the ground up, which means we went cloud first, if you want to call that a strategy. Everything that we wanted to do, we wanted to build in the cloud, and likewise, when we went to hire resources, we looked at it specifically for building the cloud infrastructure. I can tell you we have 90 servers up in the cloud, 90-ish. We have all different kinds of connections going up. Probably by the end of this, we'll have between 120 and 150 when we're done with our CWIS implementation, I would say. And with that, I have one infrastructure architect. We have three server admins. And so we've been really hiring for attitude, and then we train on the aptitude of managing in the cloud. There are not skill sets out there required to manage the kinds of infrastructures that we're building, at least not at the salaries we pay at the state. So we're looking at ways that we can train, use our premier hours to have some trainings for the staff. But I can tell you we are lean. We have really good standard operating procedures. We understand our security. We do not have managed service providers that do a lot of those services for us. We do not deal with resellers. We deal directly with Microsoft itself. So I think that's also cut and had us better manage our our capacity as far as staffing goes and the functions we provide. The other thing to that, and we kind of touched on it a little bit before when it came to the governance. So you have to have a really structured way, so while you may have people that are able to connect, and it is a different skill set than just, touching boxes and looking for flashing green lights. There's more to managing cloud infrastructure and understanding those reports that Jay said were a little bit nebulous, and understanding how to read them and determine the health of your environments. But understanding, change and release management, understanding the impacts, having good incident management process that you understand when a service is down, how it's impacting. So those are the soft skills that you also need to build up, not just being able to manage cloud services.
Great. You mentioned the ability to be nimble to changes and upgrades from cloud vendors. Joe, I'm going to ask you, what is it that you've done that allowed you to be nimble to those changes and upgrades?
Yeah, I think probably the best thing that we did to help us through this process was we really picked a group of people and we educated them on what they needed to do, and we supplemented with external help. So there's really two kinds of what I'll call skill sets that you need to move and operate systems or solutions in the cloud. One are the great wrench turners that we all have who know how to create and architect and develop a cloud environment. And those are tough resources to train and to find and to retain because there's a lot of demand for them. And so in our case, we have a small group of those folks who work with our managed service provider to keep things in check, and then we rely on agility in the scaling of our contracted services with managed service providers and application providers. I think the second area, the second skill set that helps us to move and to really make sure that we're focused on the things that we need to keep things moving smoothly is what I'll call cloud management. And I think Linda touched a little on that, but you got different skills there that you have to deal with. You're managing an account now. It's your account in the cloud. You're monitoring that account. We've had examples where even though we're paying all these service providers, we find an instance or a storage bucket that's not connected to something and that's showing up on our bill. For whatever reason, we needed it during testing, we don't need it anymore, and it hasn't been removed. So you've got a whole monitoring process that you have to create to keep that environment efficient and clean. We've had differences in the way folks show up to audit our environment, and so often we're educating those. So I guess I would sum it up as talking about those two main focus points around the architecture and the work you do to create, manage, monitor, and enhance the cloud environment, and then really there's the work you do to manage the peripheral elements that keep it running and keep it running smoothly.
Thank you. Okay, related to build and release cycles, what complexity and time issues were introduced resulting from utilizing the cloud? Now, I ask Linda and Jay to start, and then Valli to contribute, please.
So the build and release cycle. So I think one of the really important things to understand is how you actually move and spin up your environments to be efficient. So there's two parts of this. So in an on-prem solution, you can have dedicated build, test, training environments, And you really need to rethink that in a cloud environment as well. Do you always need all of the infrastructure up all of the time to manage throughout your builds? The other thing is really making sure you understand and are able to leverage kind of the scripting and the buildup of these environments as you move through your build and test cycles. So understanding how you move and leverage tools like VSTS to move your configurations through. So I think those are really important considerations that, having dedicated environments will cost and will cost you money in storage and other costs that you may not have considered before. So it's really important to understand in your build and release cycle exactly when you need those environments and how to shut them off.
Valli?
Yeah, this is Valli. That's one of the key aspects of spinning the environment and also making sure the release is happening without any issue. Because typically, when you have an on-premise environment, as Linda was pointing out, you will have dedicated team. But with the cloud environment and with multiple application teams are working, it becomes really a bottleneck when you have like a team that manages the release cycle, doing the build, setting up the environment. So we rely on automation. I would say we are close to about 60 to 70% of automating the infrastructure building, and close to about 90% for our build and release cycle management using the various scripting tools. One of the key things is, when we build these environments, in a typical, architecture, when we build with high availability, we talked about the disaster zones and everything, we tend to actually build the architecture to mimic close to what, production would look like, at least for our initial testing and everything. After the initial testing and everything is confirmed, we don't have to maintain that kind of infrastructure. So that's one of the lessons learned from our operations so far. We don't have to maintain, a similar infrastructure in a non-production environment. What that requires is a little bit of change in the way we architect the solution and help the architecture to dynamically scale rather than trying to have your entire architecture rely on the configuration that you are defining in the beginning. So there are a little bit of change in the architecture, and the scripting helps to achieve that. The pipeline for our CI/CD, automation of build and release, we rely mostly on the development team and the testing teams to automate all of this. So the DevOps team's job is to make sure that they help the initial, setup, and then from that point onwards, they will only monitor and, look at the logs and try to identify any anomalies. So that's how the setup we have in place works. Our goal is to have 100% end-to-end, DevOps release cycle, including automation of, testing our scripts. We are building like automation test library with various scenarios for different applications. So we have a dedicated team that closely works with our development team to create those scripts as well. So this is an interesting topic, and it's I would say, ever-changing nature of the various products and tools available in the market. The more you think about the change that's happening, it will be very hard to keep up with the changes. So what we have decided to do is we don't have to use all the available services or products that are claiming it's going to improve our efficiency. We will actually, look at this and only if required, we will adapt to it. So that's our strategy so far.
Great. So so that we save time for our audience Q&A, we're going to move along to lessons learned. I'm going to ask Joe to start. Let's spend about a couple of minutes each, and let's talk about the most significant lessons that you have learned. Joe?
Okay, this is Joe. Yeah, I mean, the lessons kind of span a number of areas. I think first I would say that early on we spent a lot of time working over SLAs and what we thought would be the right SLAs, and ultimately that turned out to be not a wise use of time because, quite frankly, you're going to do a deal with a cloud vendor and potentially a reseller, and they're going to give you their SLAs, right? Amazon is not going to negotiate with the Department of Children and Families here in Florida and change their whole national structure for SLAs because we're putting one system up in the cloud. So I always tell folks there's a number of things that I put on the one page of important things when I started this, and the page of what really was important is different. We learned a lot about the reality of software licenses. So you're hearing a lot of good information around being able to spin up new environments and take advantage of the cloud and expand that environment as you need it and contract it as you don't. Well, that's true with the cloud, but it's not necessarily true with your software licenses. You can only span to the level of license that you have, and depending on your solution or the vendor products that you've got there, if they're not all subscription-based, then you're probably limited in what you can expand to. So making sure that the license approach that you take when you start is appropriate, is spending time on that is well worth it. We went through a lot with the number of vendors on licenses down to where vendors even told us that our on-premise license that we had in our data center didn't transition to an in-cloud license. And so in some cases you need to expect your vendors to not have answers for you because they may not have all of these things worked out, and you'll have to work through it with them. I think we really underestimated the amount of change that we would have to go through just in managing the cloud. You've heard the panel talk about a number of things. You're not just changing an application or an infrastructure to move to a cloud. You're putting contracts in place. You're dealing with all these things you've heard discussed on the webinar today. And so there is an amount of work there that isn't a part of your normal project that you have to make sure you're staffed and ready to do. I know from our perspective, we had a lot of interest from our legislative staff and what we were doing with the funds that they had provided to us. And so as you start out on this course, I think there's some time that is well spent in marketing and communicating around where you're going and what you're doing. I think in addition to those areas, I would say that the procurement process, the more that you can leverage something that's in place. So we had, for example, we originally started out and planned to do what we call an invitation to negotiate here in Florida, which boils down to the longest, hardest procurement process that you would ever want to apply. And then as we looked, we found a national contract that we were able to have approved for use here in Florida that turned our procurement into an RFQ-based procurement, and that took literally 6 months off of our project just on the front end. So look at the contracts that are available. Make sure that you're leveraging opportunity, however your state handles procurement, whatever your procurement requirements are. Consider penalties. We worked with a number of managed service providers while we were procuring. Penalties were a surprisingly something that they were ill-prepared to discuss. So I believe when we're talking about moving systems like a child welfare system or public assistance system, they are primarily business systems with overnight batch cycles and all of these nuances necessary to complete a cycle of financials and everything. And most of the managed service providers we talked to were used to solutions. Like for one example, our managed service provider runs the online site for the NFL. So they're very used to on game day. They get so much traffic and expanding that infrastructure so they can handle that traffic and then condensing it again on non-game days. But they weren't ready for systems with overnight cycles. So there may be some curveballs you throw at them with the type of systems, some of the requirements that we have in state government around contracts, some of the liability elements. I think it was a surprise that to me that they were a little unprepared for those discussions, and ultimately whoever you select, depending on your model, you may have to help them through it. I would say that it's important to consider early on your approach, right? So you're either moving workload like database function or infrastructure, you're lifting and shifting an application, or you're re-engineering it to take a full advantage of whatever your cloud provider and infrastructure enables. I would think about all of the benefits, because there are, I think, benefits to each one of those, and make sure that you're maximizing those benefits. And I think then once you've implemented, I really think it comes looking at the staffing and the elements of how you operate and manage a system that's running in the cloud, an application that you have to consider. And things like ongoing agreements. So when we create new instances in the cloud, right, for a while we were going through a process where our managed service provider had to submit another statement of work. They didn't have a la carte menu of costs for instantiating and architecting and then operationalizing an instance. And so we've worked through those activities to be as flexible and operate as agile as we can as we move forward. In some cases, we got to the point where it was taking almost as long to gin up a resource in the cloud with all these dynamics and statements of work that we might have well not been in the cloud. And so we kind of challenged ourselves to say, hey, we're in the cloud, we have these on-demand services. How do we align our processes and all the things we do to make it efficient? I think those
Joe, for the sake of time, we have several questions in the queue, but I want to give Linda and Jay and Valli a chance to add what they believe was their most significant lesson learned. So please go ahead. Linda, Jay?
This is Jay. I'd say one of the biggest things we had to deal with and basically rethink about was vendor relationship management, both on the boots on the ground side, that being things like our server team, all the way up to infrastructure level, contract level, CIO level, indeed. We have an extremely tight relationship now with Microsoft. So we have Microsoft on premises usually at least once a week to discuss, hey, what are the new services you're offering in the cloud? What is your roadmap coming down the pipeline? So we can create these plans. We can know that we're going to ingest these services if we need to correctly, and that we're using the current services we have to the best of their ability. Microsoft's constantly adjusting things like costing models, availability solutions, being able to go through and readdress our current services to new costing models and new options that they release on a continual basis allows us to be always on the edge of making sure that we're spending money correctly, we're spending money wisely, and are utilizing the services to their fullest extent. And going back on some of the IT personnel issues, our server operator people, and we all know how IT people love interacting with other people. The big thing about it is they need to interact with vendors now. If we're majority cloud environment, my server level people, there's something wrong with the vendor itself, with the hosted service itself. They now need to interact with other people because they can't solve the problem on their own. It's not just talking to another guy in an office or a cube. It's getting somebody on the phone, and it's creating these channels, both direct channels, creating tickets inside a ticketing system, as well as back channels to people that you've dealt with at these vendors constantly to ask them, hey, is there an issue? What's going on? can I get a heads up on something? So creating those really tight relationships with vendors is going to make sure that you understand everything you need to in terms of the current roadmap, future roadmap, current licensing issues, making sure that you're using these services correctly, and making sure that your staff has those open channels to communicate what they need to and get the answers that they need as efficiently as possible.
Thank you, Jay. We're going to move now into the attendee Q&A, and we'll give Linda and Valli the first chance to answer these questions, given that they didn't provide their lessons learned. So that concludes the discussion portion. So now I'd like to invite my colleague Nick to run the Q&A session. Nick?
Hello there, everyone. This is Nick Moser, Junior Analyst with the Division of State Systems. I'm going to read our first question, and it actually is directly for Florida, so sorry for the mix-up there. But, Joe, did you have any difficulty integrating the cloud CWIS with on-prem medical and benefits systems? And then the follow-up question is, do you use MMIS to validate and pull client information into the CWIS?
Yeah, so I have to confess that our CWIS is our SACWIS renamed, and so we're at the point now where we're determining how to get data in and out of the system, what the final architecture for it will be. I think ultimately, though, we're not seeing any issues in moving data because we do move data from other systems, as the question alluded to. So we're moving benefits information in and out. The system is connected to our public assistance system. We have a robust interface there for Medicaid eligibility determination and all of the data that has to flow. And so basically the cloud is sitting as a component on our network. And we really, once we resolved all of the network connections, which was an interesting process, you learn how much a system is connected to when you move it. It really was, once we had that done, it really does sit like a application within our network with the right capacity, given the size of the pipeline that we've got to move data back and forth. And so our challenge, too, is that we receive data from external providers. Our child welfare system has an outsourced component to it on the service side, and so all of that data flows still in from our state network through to our connection to the application in the cloud and then to our CWIS.
Thank you very much. Operator, do we have any questions over the phone? And if you can remind participants about how they can ask questions, please.
Thank you so much. As a reminder, if you have a question over the phone lines, please press star then 1. Unmute your phone and record your name clearly so I may introduce your question. Presently, I have no questions in queue, but again, please press star then 1 anytime.
Thank you very much. And just as a note, I want to make sure that this has been such a fascinating presentation and webinar, and we want to be respectful of your time. So if you do have questions and we are unable to get them answered within the time frame that we have allotted, with your permission, we'd love to follow up with you and with the panelists afterwards to get you the answers to those questions, and ideally we can post them online as well. It may be the case that the question that you ask helps a fellow colleague that you have out there, perhaps in a different state. Thank you very much, everybody. Operator, do we have any questions in the queue in that interim?
No, we do not. Thank you.
Thank you. I will now read our next question. So the next question is for Maryland. What is the vehicle for your real-time data exchanges, i.e., what tool or enterprise service bus, etc.?
Okay, so this is Valli. For our real-time data exchanges, we actually are using the Apache products. So one of the things that we decided to do from the beginning is to use for almost all our products to be open source. So we actually have used the Apache product to build the enterprise service bus. So it's a very simple messaging system that actually connects, in a very simple way with the external or internal real-time data exchanges. We use, XML and JSON-based exchanges. So one of the things that we decided to do, as I said in the beginning, is keep it very simple that's one of the lessons learned from our perspective also. Keep it a simple solution and a repeatable way to leverage the same code as much as possible for all our data exchanges, for real-time as well as for bulk data exchange as well.
Thank you very much. Operator, do we have any questions over the phone?
No, we do not. Please press star then one, unmute your phone, and record your name if you do have a question. Again, I have nothing at this time.
Thank you. Joyce, I'm going to do a quick time check. At what time do you want to transition to concluding this webinar? I want to inquire whether we have room for another question.
You certainly have room for one question and maybe two.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So I've seen a couple of different questions related to cost, so I'm going to combine a few. So please bear with me. I'm curious whether your state IT organizations led or hindered your movement to the cloud, how well the state IT organization does in cloud management and governance, and whether there is any redundancy between roles state IT insists on filling and what is offered or automated on the cloud. And regarding rates, do state IT charges negate the financial benefits of moving to the cloud? And an additional follow-up from another participant, do any of you believe that this transition to cloud services has saved you money compared to the previous system?
Yeah, this is Valli. I just want to quickly point out, obviously, our analysis points out that we will be saving several millions of dollars. We can actually slice and dice this in many ways, but however way we did, obviously we realized consolidating many data centers that we use within the state of Maryland. Many agencies have their own IT team and IT budget just for hosting alone. Bringing everybody into one platform, and use like infrastructure as a service and platform as a service definitely is expected to save several millions of dollars. So cost saving definitely is there, no question about it. In terms of how we are going to achieve it, how we are going to share the various resources, whether IT resource or your license that you may have already purchased for on-premise use, those are the things, require some additional discussion upfront. And then once the agencies agree, definitely the cloud model would benefit, the entire state and individual agencies in the long run.
This is Joe. Just to add to that, I wrote down a number of the questions. So did the state IT organization help or hinder? Here in Florida, I would say that our state IT organization helped. Quite frankly, they had to approve our procurement mechanism for alternative services, alternative IT services. There wasn't a lot they could help on in terms of us selecting a cloud provider because in some cases, in many cases, that was in advance of them doing it themselves. As far as redundancy goes, there's certainly redundancy in basically all of it. We have a infrastructure as a service in the cloud that's provided by the state in the data center, and we have managed services that's also provided. And as far as savings go, when I look at our numbers, we're running at 50% of the cost to the state that it costed to run the application in our state data center, and the application is actually performing at a higher level, so it services more users. And then I think the last piece was something around IT state charges. So once we moved in December of last year to the cloud, and so our budget for the system continued to be applied to the state data center until we got past the end of the year. So there was a whole set of dynamics that we worked with the legislative staff and our data center around, given the reality for how the state data center is funded.
This is Jay also. there's a lot of different perspectives to look at here, especially when you start dealing with potential cost savings and actual cost savings. Being able to properly leverage, obviously, the resources, if you do it correctly, you are going to save money a lot of the time. At a minimum, you're also going to reap a lot of benefits that you potentially never be able to, buy beforehand. So I would argue that there's very few, if any, states in the nation that would be able to afford a fully redundant infrastructure that a cloud provider would give you if you properly leverage the services, as having resources replicated to multiple physical data centers, having data replicated between multiple racks within that same data center. These are things that are just very expensive components to not only buy but then maintain on an ongoing basis. Also, taking use of the consume and basically buy and consume at the same time. One of the easiest things to look at there in terms of saving money is things like a backup or restore infrastructure. Being able to build that on-prem, you have to buy the majority of the storage that you're going to use right off the bat. Whether you're going to use it or not, you have to forecast for how much you're going to use, and that's a very large cost outlay. Using something on a consume basis, it allows us to use that infrastructure for only what we actually need, but it expand at an infinite level and use all of what we need at any point in time without having that huge initial cost outlay, and then, of course, on-prem management after that. In terms of dealing with the state charges from this, one of the big things about that is just making sure that people that you need to justify these costs against understand the difference between owning the IT infrastructure versus essentially renting the IT infrastructure at this point in time. Being able to properly explain that to them so they actually understand these things and understand the reason as to why in some cases it is better to go to a cloud infrastructure than hosting it on-prem, then we find that those hurdles are fairly easy to get over. But that can be a fairly large hurdle in terms of properly explaining and making sure that is consumed correctly.
Thank you very much. This is Nick Moser again. We have run out of time for the question and answer session. If anybody has additional questions that they would like answered, please feel free to enter them into the chat box and we will follow up with you afterwards. Panelists, again, I can't thank you enough for everything that you've contributed today. This has been so fascinating. I'm stealing Joyce Rose's thunder, though, so with that, I will transition to Joyce. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nick. Obviously, I think we could go for another hour in discussing this particular topic. Very interesting and very fascinating. So I also, on behalf of the Children's Bureau, want to thank our panelists, Linda, Jay, Valli, and Joe. If any of you would like to contact them directly, their contact info is listed. And this webinar has been recorded and will be made available online. When it is complete and posted, a message will be sent announcing availability on the Children's Bureau website. In terms of upcoming events, those topics are under discussion right now, and the schedule will be posted starting in October. So thank you all for attending, and that ends the roundtable discussion. Thank you. Goodbye.